You expect anyone in this room to believe a 16-year-old cooked up a medical breakthrough in a garage? Principal Bryce Calloway said it into a microphone in front of 400 people at the Eastview Regional Science Symposium on a Thursday evening in March. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed. Not literally rehearsed, but rehearsed in the sense that the sentence had been sitting in him, fully formed, since the moment he first read the project abstract 3 weeks earlier, and decided, before he had asked a single question, exactly what kind of boy had written it. He said, "Either you copied this from somewhere or you made it up. Either way, you're done at this school." The boy standing at the project table did not move. His name was Elijah. He was 17, tall, quiet, dressed in a button-down shirt his grandmother had ironed that morning with the kind of care that goes into things that matter. On the table in front of him sat a trifold display board, a row of small sealed test vials, a laptop showing a chart, and, set slightly apart from everything else, the way you set apart something that does not belong to the display, something that belongs to you, a leather-bound notebook, dark brown, cracked at the spine with the faded gold initials WT, stamped into the lower corner. Elijah looked at Principal Calloway. He looked at him for 3 full seconds before he answered, and when he answered, his voice was calm, steady. The kind of steady that takes a person somewhere they have already been many times before. He said, "I didn't make it up. Mr. Calloway and I didn't do it alone." 400 people went quiet. Nobody in that auditorium moved. 3 judges at the front table, university researchers here as volunteers, here to score projects on the strength of their methodology, sat very still, looking at each other in the specific way of people who have just heard something they were not expecting and are trying to decide whether they are allowed to react to it yet. He had no idea what was sitting in that leather notebook. He had no idea that 9 days earlier, Elijah had mailed a sealed sample of that compound, the same compound in the vials on that table, to a university research laboratory 200 miles away for independent testing. He had no idea that the results were due back any day. He had just made the most public mistake of his career in front of the only room in the county that would remember every word of it. Have you ever told the truth, calmly, in a room that had already decided you were lying? Have you ever watched someone destroy something of yours because they couldn't imagine it was real? Let me take you back 8 years, before this auditorium, before Principal Calloway, before any of it. Let me take you back to where Elijah begins. The house on Penrose Lane was small. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened directly into the living room, a backyard with a single pecan tree that dropped its shells onto the lawn every October in a way that Elijah's grandmother, Ruth Thorne, swept up every single morning without complaint because she said a clean yard was a kind of prayer you said with your hands. Ruth had raised Elijah since he was 9. After his parents had been killed in a car accident on the interstate on a rainy night that Elijah did not remember clearly and that Ruth never discussed unless he asked, and even then only in small pieces offered carefully, the way you hand someone something sharp. Ruth Thorne was 71. She had worked for 34 years as a school cafeteria manager. Not a teacher, not an administrator. The woman who made sure 400 children got fed every day on a budget that never quite matched the number of children. And she had retired 3 years before this story begins with a pension that covered the mortgage and not much else. She kept the house immaculate. She kept a small black Bible on the kitchen table, not for show, but because she read 3 verses from it every morning with her coffee, the same 3-year reading plan she had followed for as long as Elijah had been alive. She went to Mount Calvary Church of God in Christ every Sunday, where she sat in the 4th pew on the left, where she had sat for 40 years, where the congregation had watched her raise 2 generations of children, her own son, and now her grandson, with the same quiet, relentless devotion. In the garage behind the house, a single-car garage that had not held a car in 15 years, there was a workbench. On that workbench sat a collection of equipment that, to an untrained eye, looked like a strange assortment of second-hand junk. A small centrifuge purchased from a university surplus auction for $60, a set of glass beakers from a closing high school chemistry lab a digital scale accurate to 1/100th of a gram that Elijah had saved for over 8 months of mowing lawns, a mini fridge that had been repurposed, with Ruth's blessing and a sign on the door that said in Elijah's careful handwriting, "Not food. Please do not eat." This was Elijah's lab. He had built it himself, piece by piece, over 4 years. He had built it because of the notebook. The notebook had belonged to Ruth's husband, Elijah's grandfather, a man named Walter Thorne, who had died 11 years before Elijah was born, and whom Elijah had therefore never met, except in the way that a person can meet someone through the things they leave behind, which is its own kind of meeting, slower but in some ways more complete. Walter Thorne had been a laboratory technician at Halloran Pharmaceuticals from 1968 until 1981. Technician was the title on his employee badge. It was not, by any honest accounting of what he actually did in that laboratory, an accurate title. Walter Thorne had a mind that worked the way certain minds work, a mind that saw patterns in data the way some people see patterns in music, that could hold a dozen variables in suspension and feel, almost physically, which combination was going to matter. He had no formal degree beyond a 2-year certificate from a technical college, because in 1968, in the town where he grew up, a 4-year degree in chemistry was a door that did not open for a young black man, no matter how hard he pushed on it. He took the technician job because it was the closest he could get to the work he wanted to do, and then he did that work, quietly, relentlessly, in the margins of his actual job description, for 13 years. In 1979, Walter Thorne began a line of independent research, conducted largely on his own time, into a class of compounds derived from a common plant extract that he believed could reduce the frequency and severity of pain crises associated with sickle cell disease, a condition that, then as now, disproportionately affected black patients, and that, then as now, received a fraction of the research investment of conditions that affected wealthier and whiter populations in greater numbers. He kept his findings in a notebook, dark brown leather, his initials stamped in the corner, WT. A notebook he had bought himself because the company-issued lab notebooks were tracked and logged, and he did not, at first, want anyone tracking this. He brought a preliminary version of his findings to his supervisor in 1981. He had run small-scale tests. He had documentation. He had a hypothesis that, if correct, could lead to a treatment that would cost a fraction of the existing options, and that could be manufactured cheaply enough to reach the patients who needed it most. His supervisor reviewed it for 11 days. His supervisor then told him, in a meeting that lasted 4 minutes, that the company's research priorities for the coming fiscal year did not include this therapeutic area, that Walter's time would be better directed toward his assigned duties, and that he should consider this matter closed. 3 months later, Walter Thorne was let go in a round of what the company called restructuring. 4 technicians were let go in that round. Walter Thorne was the only one of the 4 who was not offered a position at any of the company's other facilities. He never worked in a laboratory again. He spent the next 30 years as a maintenance worker for the county school district, the same district that, decades later, his grandson would attend. He fixed boilers. He replaced fluorescent tube lights in classroom ceilings. He kept a small toolbox in his truck and a notebook, a different one, a small spiral one, in which he wrote down, in a habit he could not break, observations, patterns, things he noticed. He never stopped thinking like a scientist. He simply stopped being allowed to be one, professionally, by people who decided that what he had found in 1981 was not worth 11 days of consideration, and certainly not worth a career. He died in 1991. He left behind a wife, a grown son, and a brown leather notebook that nobody opened for 26 years. Ruth kept it in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, along with Walter's watch, his reading glasses, and a folded American flag from his brief military service in his 20s. She did not open the notebook because she could not read the chemistry in it. She had never claimed to understand the work Walter did, only that she had believed, completely, that it mattered because Walter had told her it mattered, on nights when he came home frustrated and exhausted, and she had listened to him anyway, for 13 years, even when she didn't fully follow the words. She opened the cedar chest when Elijah was 13, because Elijah had asked about his grandfather, a question he had started asking more frequently as he got older, the way children reach an age where the people who came before them stop being abstractions and start being questions. And she had wanted to give him something real. Not a story, a thing. She gave him the notebook. Elijah read it cover to cover 4 times before he understood what he was looking at. He was 13. He did not have the chemistry background to fully follow it, but he had something else. He had his grandfather's mind, passed down the way certain things are passed down, skipping a generation sometimes, landing in a person who is ready for it. He started reading, not casually. He started checking out library books on biochemistry. He found free university lecture courses online and watched them after school at the kitchen table with the notebook open beside his own. By 15, he had built the garage lab. By 16, he had replicated, with equipment that cost a fraction of what a university lab would spend, the preliminary experiments his grandfather had described in 1979 and 1980. By 17, he had gone further than his grandfather ever got the chance to go, because his grandfather had been stopped after 11 days, and Elijah had 4 years, and a notebook, and nobody telling him to direct his time elsewhere. He had not told anyone outside his family the full scope of what he was working on. He had entered a modest version of it, framed conservatively, described in careful, hedged scientific language, in the Eastview Regional Science Symposium, because the symposium had a research category that allowed for independent projects, and because the judges were university researchers who might, he thought, be able to tell him whether he was onto something real or whether 4 years of work in a garage had led him somewhere that didn't actually go anywhere. 9 days before the symposium, he had done one more thing. Something he hadn't told Ruth about until after he'd done it, because he didn't want her to worry about the cost. $68, money he had saved from mowing lawns, for overnight shipping of a sealed, properly prepared sample to an independent university laboratory that offered compound analysis services to the public, with a turnaround time of 2 to 3 weeks. He wanted to know if he was right before he stood up in front of anyone and said so. He didn't get the chance to wait for the answer before someone else decided the answer for him. Now let me tell you about Principal Bryce Calloway, because you cannot understand what happened in that auditorium without understanding the floor he was standing on. A floor that had been holding him, up for 11 years without ever once being tested. Bryce Calloway had been the principal of Eastview High School for 11 years. Before that, he had been an assistant principal for 6. He was, by every formal measure the district used, a successful administrator. Test scores at Eastview had improved modestly during his tenure. The school's facilities had been renovated under a bond measure he had championed, and he had a relationship with the district's largest donor, a regional medical device company called Corvath Diagnostics, whose founder had attended Eastview decades earlier, and whose foundation had funded the science wing where this symposium was being held. What the formal measures did not capture, what existed instead in a set of records that the district's equity office had been quietly compiling for 3 years, in response to a state mandate that most districts treated as a paperwork exercise, was a pattern in Eastview's discipline data. Black students at Eastview were suspended at 4 times the rate of white students for comparable infractions. Black students were referred for expulsion hearings at 6 times the rate. And in the 11 years of Bryce Calloway's tenure, every single expulsion recommendation that had reached the district board, 18 of them, had been upheld. 18 for 18. The equity office's report, completed 4 months before this story begins and sitting at the time in a queue of documents the district's general counsel had not yet reviewed, used a phrase that would later become significant. A pattern consistent with differential application of disciplinary discretion, particularly in cases involving academic integrity allegations against high-achieving black students. High-achieving black students. 5 of the 18 prior expulsions had involved exactly this profile, a student with strong academic standing, accused, on the basis of the principal's own judgment rather than any external review, of cheating, plagiarism, or fabrication. In 4 of those 5 cases, The accusation had not been substantiated by any outside body because no outside body had ever been asked. 5 for 5, about to become 6 for 6, in front of 400 people and 3 university researchers with clipboards. This was the floor Bryce Calloway was standing on when he picked up the microphone at the Eastview Regional Science Symposium and decided, before he had asked Elijah a single substantive question about his methodology, exactly what kind of project this was and exactly what kind of consequence it deserved. This was the floor that was about to be tested for the first time in 11 years. Now back to that auditorium, back to that microphone. Because what happened after Elijah said, "I didn't make it up, Mr. Calloway, and I didn't do it alone," was not what Calloway expected. Calloway said, "Then who did you do it with? Because I don't see a research partner on this form. I see your name, and I see a project that, and I've had this looked at, by the way. I had someone from the district office review your abstract. Claims a therapeutic effect that, frankly, people with PhDs and 20 years of funding haven't managed to find." He said, "So either there's a research partner you haven't disclosed, which is a violation of the symposium rules, or there isn't, which means this entire project is fabricated. Either way." He reached for the leather notebook on the table. He said, "What is this supposed to be? Is this your lab journal?" He picked it up. He opened it, flipping through pages of handwriting that was not Elijah's handwriting. From 1979 and 1980, cramped and careful, in a different hand entirely, with diagrams and calculations that Calloway clearly could not read, and equally clearly had decided he did not need to. He said, "This doesn't even look like your handwriting." Elijah's hands, which had been still at his sides this entire time, moved for the first time. "Just slightly. Just enough," he said. "That's not mine. That's my grandfather's." "Please," Calloway said, "your grandfather's." He said it the way you repeat something you've decided is absurd, giving it back to the room so the room can hear how absurd it is. "Your grandfather's research from, the 70s? You're telling me your grandfather did this research in the 70s, and somehow nobody at any pharmaceutical company in 50 years has picked it up, and now you, a junior at Eastview High School, are the one who's going to." He didn't finish the sentence. He closed the notebook. He held it for a moment, and then, not violently, not with any dramatic gesture, but with the flat, dismissive carelessness of a man clearing a table of something he considers debris, he set it down at the edge of the table, and as he turned to address the judges, his elbow caught the edge of it, and it slid off the table and onto the floor. And the impact, against the hard auditorium floor, from a height of 3 feet, was enough to crack the brittle old spine clean through. The notebook fell open on the floor, face down, pages bent. Elijah did not move toward it, not yet. He looked at it on the floor, 45 years of his grandfather's handwriting, the only physical trace of a career that had been taken from a man in a 4-minute meeting in 1981. And something in his face changed for the first time all evening. Not anger, something quieter and heavier than anger. The look of a person watching something irreplaceable get treated as nothing, in real time, by someone who doesn't even know what they've broken. Then he knelt down. He picked it up. He held it against his chest. The way you hold something precious, the way a person holds something they have decided, in that moment, they will protect with their whole body if they have to. Calloway, still addressing the judges, said, "I'm recommending this project be disqualified, and I'll be initiating an academic integrity review with the district. Effective immediately, this student is suspended, pending an expulsion hearing." He turned back to Elijah. He said, "You can pack up your things." 400 people sat in that auditorium, and not one of them said a word. But what Bryce Calloway didn't know, and what almost nobody in that room knew yet, was that one of the 3 judges at the front table, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, had stopped looking at her clipboard the moment Calloway said the words sickle cell disease, and had not looked away since. Her name was Dr. Priya Anand. She was a research scientist. Not at the university whose name was on her judge's badge, that was her day job, but in her actual field of specialization, the thing she had built her career on, the thing she had spent 11 years of postdoctoral and faculty's research pursuing with limited funding and, limited institutional interest because her field, like Walter Thorne's, was a field that the larger research economy had never prioritized. She studied compounds for sickle cell disease. She had read Elijah's abstract 3 weeks ago when the symposium packets were distributed to judges for advance review, and she had read it twice, and she had thought, the second time, this kid understands something about reaction kinetics that most graduate students don't understand. She had assumed, reasonably, that an adult had helped him, a parent, a teacher, someone. She had not assumed fraud. She had assumed mentorship, which is a normal and unremarkable thing to assume about a strong student project. She had not yet had the chance to ask Elijah about it, because Calloway had taken the microphone before the judge's question period began. She stood up. She said, "Mr. Calloway, before this goes any further, I'd like to ask the student some questions about his methodology." That's actually what the judging period is for. Calloway said, "Dr. Anand, I think given the integrity concerns," she said, "I understand the concerns. I'd like to address them by doing my job, which is asking him about his work." She turned to Elijah, she said, gently. The gentleness was deliberate. The gentleness was a choice. And everyone in that room who was paying attention understood that it was a choice. "Can you walk me through your synthesis pathway? Specifically, the second step, the part where you describe the temperature-controlled reaction. Walk me through why you chose that temperature range." And Elijah, still holding the cracked notebook against his chest with one arm, walked her through it. He explained it the way his grandfather had written it, and the way he had verified it. Over 4 years, in a garage with second-hand equipment, he explained why the temperature mattered, what happened if it was too high, what happened if it was too low, what he had observed in his own trials at each variation, and why the specific window his grandfather had identified in 1980 turned out, when Elijah tested it himself with modern measurement tools his grandfather never had access to be almost exactly right, off by less than 2 degrees. He talked for 6 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, Dr. Priya Anand sat back down, slowly, and she looked at her clipboard for a long moment without writing anything. And then she looked back up at Elijah and she said, quietly, "Where did you send the sample?" The room had been quiet before. It went quieter. Elijah said, "Cordray University Analytical Chemistry Lab 9 days ago." Dr. Anand nodded slowly. She said, "I know that lab." She did not say anything else. But she wrote something down. And what she wrote, though nobody in that auditorium could read it, was a name and a phone number and a note to herself. Call Monday. But what nobody in that room knew yet, not Calloway, not Elijah, not even Dr. Anand, not in full, was that the Cordray University Analytical Lab had completed its analysis 2 days early. The results had been emailed that morning. They were sitting, unopened, in the inbox of an email account that Elijah checked on his phone, which was currently in his backpack, which Calloway had just told him to go pack up. Now let's go back. Let me take you back to that house on Penrose Lane, 2 days later, because what happened next did not happen in the auditorium. It happened at a kitchen table with a cracked notebook on the table between 2 people who loved each other. Elijah had been suspended. The expulsion hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 6 days away. The district's academic integrity office had sent a letter on official letterhead citing fabrication of research data and unauthorized use of project materials inconsistent with the disclosed scope of the project. Language that, when Ruth read it aloud at the kitchen table, made her put the letter down very carefully, the way you put down something you are afraid you might otherwise crush. She said, "Did you check your email?" Elijah hadn't. Not since the symposium. He had been avoiding it, in the specific way a person avoids something when they are afraid that good news might somehow make the bad news worse, might somehow be one more thing that gets taken away. He checked it. The email had arrived at 6:47 that morning, 4 days after the symposium. Subject line, analysis results, sample EMO31. From the Cordray University Department of Chemistry, Analytical Services Laboratory. He opened it at the kitchen table, with Ruth sitting across from him, with the cracked notebook between them, with the pecan tree outside the window, dropping its last shells of the season onto a lawn that Ruth had not yet swept that morning because she had been waiting for him to wake up. He read it once silently. Then he read it again, out loud, because some things need to be said out loud to be believed. The report confirmed the compound's identity and purity. It confirmed that laboratory testing, conducted on blood samples provided through an anonymized academic partnership program, with full consent and IRB protocols Elijah had researched and followed meticulously, because his grandfather's notebook had taught him that good science follows the rules even when nobody is watching, showed a measurable, statistically significant reduction in the rate of red blood cells sickling under the laboratory conditions tested. The report used careful, hedged scientific language, the kind of language that scientists use because they have learned that overpromising costs lives and credibility both. It did not say cure. It did not say breakthrough. It said, these results warrant further investigation and suggest the compound merits consideration for advanced preclinical study. Ruth read it twice. She put her hand on the cracked notebook. She said, 11 days. Elijah said, what? She said, your grandfather waited 11 days for an answer. 11 days, and then 4 minutes, and then it was over. She looked at the email on the screen. She looked at the notebook. She said, it took you 4 years, and it took them. She gestured at the email. 2 weeks, she said. I think it's time we called somebody. Now let me tell you about the hearing. Let me take you back to that room. A smaller room this time, the district board room, fluorescent lit, with a long table at the front and folding chairs in rows, scheduled for 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening, 6 days after the symposium. What Bryce Calloway expected, walking into that room, was a formality. 5 for 5 had become 6 for 6 in every prior case, and he had no reason, none that he had ever been given, in 11 years, to expect this one would be different. He had his statement prepared. He had the academic integrity letter. He had, he believed, a clean and straightforward case. A student had presented work he could not adequately explain, work that made claims inconsistent with the known state of scientific research, work that included materials, the notebook, that the student himself admitted were not his own. What he did not have when he walked into that room was any idea that Dr. Priya Anand had spent the previous Monday on the phone with Cordray University and had spoken with the lab director, and had then spent Tuesday and Wednesday on the phone with 3 colleagues in her field. Actual specialists, the small, underfunded, deeply committed community of researchers who work on sickle cell disease, and who, because the field is small, mostly know each other, and that all 4 of them, independently, had said some version of the same thing. If this holds up, this is significant. This is worth a real look. He did not know that Dr. Anand had requested to attend the hearing as a witness. He did not know that Ruth Thorne had, on Thursday, called the district's equity office directly, not to file a complaint about Calloway specifically, not yet, but to ask a simple question. How many expulsion recommendations has Principal Calloway made in his tenure, and how many of them were upheld? And that the woman who answered the phone, a woman named Denise Calhoun, who had been sitting on a completed equity report for 4 months, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask her exactly this question, had said, I can get you that information. Actually, can I ask why you're asking? He did not know that Denise Calhoun had attended the hearing too, quietly, in the back row, with a folder. The hearing began the way these hearings begin. The recitation of the charge, the presentation of the academic integrity letter, Calloway's statement delivered in the same flat, certain tone he had used in the auditorium, describing a student who had presented unverifiable work, who had been unable to produce a research partner, who had presented materials, a notebook, Calloway said, that the student admits is not his own work, as though they were his own. The board chair, a retired judge named Constance Iyer, who had been appointed to the district board 2 years earlier, specifically because the board had wanted someone with experience in due process, asked Calloway a single question. She said, did you, at any point before recommending suspension, ask the student to explain the notebook? Calloway said, the notebook isn't really the issue, Judge Iyer. The issue is, she said, I asked you a direct question. Did you ask him to explain it before you decided what it meant? There was a pause. Calloway said, no. Judge Iyer wrote something down. She said, continue. And then it was Elijah's turn. He did not have a lawyer. Ruth had asked about one, and a local attorney, a man named James Whitfield, who did pro bono education law work and who had taken the case the moment Ruth described it to him over the phone, had agreed to come, but the hearing had been scheduled faster than he could clear his calendar. And so for the first 15 minutes, it was just Elijah and Ruth and the cracked notebook, sitting at a folding table in front of a board that had upheld 18 out of 18 prior recommendations. Elijah stood. He had the notebook with him. He had, in the 6 days since the symposium, carefully repaired the broken spine himself, with bookbinding glue and a clamp, the way he imagined his grandfather might have fixed something in his own workshop, patiently, without complaint. He told them about Walter Thorne. He told them about 1981, and the 11 days and the 4-minute meeting, and the 30 years of fixing boilers in school buildings, not unlike this one. He told them about the cedar chest, and being 13, and 4 years in a garage. He said, "I sent a sample to Cordray University before the symposium, not because I doubted my work, because I wanted to know if I was right before I asked anyone else to believe me. I thought that was the responsible thing to do." He said, "The results came back 4 days ago." He took out his phone. He said, "I'd like to read them into the record, if that's allowed." Judge Iyer looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Go ahead." And Elijah read the email, all of it. The careful, hedged, scientific language, "These results warrant further investigation. The compound merits consideration for advanced preclinical study." Language that was modest and precise, and that, read aloud in that room by a 17-year-old in a button-down shirt his grandmother had ironed, holding his dead grandfather's repaired notebook in his other hand, did not sound modest at all. He finished reading. He set the phone down on the table. The room was silent. It was the kind of silence that has a texture to it, the silence of 40 people, simultaneously recalculating something they had each, individually, already decided. Dr. Priya Anand, sitting in the second row, did not move. Denise Calhoun, in the back, did not move. Ruth Thorne sat with her hands folded in her lap, the way she had sat in the 4th pew of Mount Calvary for 40 years, still and certain. And Bryce Calloway, who had spent 11 years in rooms where his certainty had never once been tested, who had stood at a microphone 6 days earlier and said, "You expect anyone in this room to believe," sat at the front table, and the color left his face the way water leaves a cracked vessel. Not dramatically, just steadily and completely, until there was nothing left in his expression but the look of a man hearing, for the first time in his career, the sound of a floor giving way beneath him. He said, "I," and then he didn't say anything else. Judge Iyer let the silence sit for a long moment. Then she said, "I think we're going to take a short recess. Go back and watch that moment, if you ever get the chance, the recess that followed, the way people in that room and actually moved once the recess was called. Watch Dr. Anand cross the room directly to Ruth and Elijah, not to Calloway. Watch Denise Calhoun open her folder for the first time, not for Calloway, but for Judge Iyer. Watch the room sort itself in real time into the people who had been waiting for this moment and the one person who had no idea it was coming. But what happened in that recess, and in the weeks that followed, is where this story becomes about more than one boy, and more than one principal, and more than one notebook. The board's vote, when the hearing resumed 40 minutes later, was unanimous. The expulsion recommendation was rejected. The suspension was rescinded, with the board ordering it expunged from Elijah's record entirely, not just removed, but treated as though it had never been entered, restoring the 4 days of school he had missed, and noting in the official record that no disciplinary action of any kind was warranted. That was the easy part. The harder part began the following week, when Denise Calhoun's equity report, the one that had been sitting in a queue for 4 months, was finally placed on the board's agenda, at Judge Iyer's request, alongside a new item, a review of Bryce Calloway's tenure as principal, specifically with respect to the 18 for 18 pattern. The review took 11 weeks. It examined all 18 prior expulsion cases. It found that in 11 of them, the recommending evidence had come exclusively from Calloway's own observation and judgment, without independent verification. The same pattern as Elijah's case, just without a Cordray University lab report to interrupt it. It found that 5 of the 18 students had been black students with strong academic records, accused, as Elijah had been, of academic dishonesty on the principal's sole determination. Of those 5, 3 families had not contested the expulsion, had simply withdrawn the student and enrolled elsewhere, absorbing the cost and disruption rather than fight a process that had a perfect record against them. The review recommended Calloway's removal. The board voted to remove him 8 weeks after the hearing, citing a pattern of disciplinary decision-making inconsistent with due process standards and disproportionately impacting black students. He did not contest it publicly. He retired. The district, separately, reached out to each of the 5 families from those prior cases. 2 declined to revisit anything. They had moved on, and moving on for them meant not reopening it. 2 agreed to have their cases formally reviewed. Both expulsions were reversed and expunged, 4 and 7 years after the fact. 1 family could not be located. 2 families, 4 and 7 years. Records corrected, not erased, corrected. The difference matters. An erasure pretends something didn't happen. A correction says, it happened, and it was wrong, and now the record says so. The story reached beyond the district within days of the hearing. Not because anyone sought press attention, but because one of the parents in the audience that Tuesday evening had recorded part of the hearing on her phone for her own records and had later shared a clip. Not of Calloway's collapse, which felt to her like something too raw to share, but of Elijah reading the lab results aloud, his voice steady, the room around him gone completely still. The clip was 41 seconds. It was picked up by a local education reporter, then a regional outlet, then. Because the underlying story touched on sickle cell disease, on pharmaceutical research history, on a notebook from 1979 that had waited 45 years to be read by someone who understood it. By science. Journalists who recognized that this was not only a story about a school district. It was a story about who gets to do science, and who gets believed when they do it, and what happens to discoveries that arrive in the wrong hands at the wrong time. The hashtag that formed around it was simple, and it was not about Calloway at all. Read the notebook. It became shorthand, in certain circles, for a particular kind of institutional failure. The failure to investigate before judging. The failure to ask, what is this, before deciding this can't be real. People used it about other things entirely, about ideas dismissed, about credentials doubted, about work attributed to someone else because the person who actually did it didn't fit the picture of who does that kind of work. It traveled because, like all the best phrases, it named something a great many people had felt and had not had words for. Cordray University's chemistry department, whose analytical lab had processed Elijah's sample as one of hundreds of routine public submissions that month, found itself fielding media calls about a result that, 2 weeks earlier, had been filed and forgotten. The lab director, a man who had signed off on the report without a second thought, because the report was careful and modest and did not claim more than the data supported, gave one interview in which he said, simply, that the data was the data, and that the data didn't care how old the person submitting it was, or where the original research had come from, or who had been allowed to do science and who hadn't. He said that was, in his view, the entire point of having a lab that does this kind of analysis at all. He then did something else. He reached out to Dr. Priya Anand, whom he knew slightly through the small world of researchers in her field, and the 2 of them, along with 2 of the colleagues Dr. Anand had called the week of the hearing, began the process of formally bringing Elijah's compound and Walter Thorne's original 1979 and 1980 data into a structured research program. Not a press release, not a headline. A research program, slow, careful, multi-year process of preclinical study that the Cordray report had recommended, the process that turns this merits consideration into something that might, eventually, years from now, become something that helps people. Halloran Pharmaceuticals, the company that had employed Walter Thorne, that had reviewed his findings for 11 days in 1981, and then closed the matter, still existed, under a different name as part of a larger pharmaceutical group. A journalist covering the story found, in the company's own archived research records made available through a records request related to an unrelated regulatory matter, the original 1981 memo, the one that closed the matter, It was 4 sentences long. It cited current research priorities and resource allocation for the coming fiscal year, and it did not mention sickle cell disease by name at all. The company, when asked for comment, issued a statement acknowledging historical research decisions that, viewed through the lens of current scientific understanding, may not reflect the priorities we would set today, and announced a research grant, modest but real, and structured as an ongoing commitment rather than a one-time gesture to the Cordry University program now studying the compound. The grant was named, at the company's own suggestion, after the man whose findings had sat in a cedar chest for 26 years, the Walter Thorne Research Fellowship, awarded annually to a researcher working on understudied conditions disproportionately affecting communities that have historically received less research investment. Its first recipient, the year it was established, was a postdoctoral researcher in Dr. Priya Anand's lab. Its second recipient, 3 years later, was Elijah, not as a symbolic gesture, but because by then he had finished his first 2 years of undergraduate study in biochemistry on a full scholarship at Cordry University, in the same department whose lab had read his sample 2 weeks instead of 11 days, and he had spent every summer since the hearing working in that lab on that compound, with Dr. Anand as his advisor. He kept the notebook on the shelf above his desk in his dorm room. The spine, repaired with bookbinding glue and a clamp, had held. 1 year after the hearing, almost exactly 1 year, the timing was not planned, but it was noticed. Eastview High School held its annual science symposium again in the same auditorium, on the same kind of Thursday evening in March. The science wing was still funded by the same donor. The judges' table still had 3 chairs. Elijah was invited back, not as a competitor, as a guest judge. He sat at the table in the same auditorium, and he listened to a freshman, a girl, 14 years old, nervous, presenting a modest project about water filtration using materials she'd found in her family's recycling. And when she finished and stood there waiting, the way students wait, for someone in authority to tell her what her work was worth, Elijah did not tell her what it was worth. He asked her a question about her methodology, the same kind of question Dr. Anand had asked him a year and 6 days earlier in this same room. He said, "Walk me through why you chose that filter material. What did you try first and why didn't it work?" And the girl, surprised, then steadying, the way a person steadies when someone finally asks them the question that lets them show what they actually know, told him. He listened to all of it. This story reached something in you. If any part of it landed in a place you recognize, share it. Pass it to someone who needs it, the way a notebook gets passed down, the way a question gets passed forward from one person who was finally asked it, to another person who hasn't been yet. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And before you go, leave one thing in the comments. Has someone ever doubted something of yours before they understood it? What would it have meant if, instead, they had simply asked you to explain it? Here's what really gets me, sitting with this one. It's not the principle. By now you know that's never the part that gets me. Bryce Calloway is 11 years of an unexamined system wearing a name and a tie. What gets me is the 11 days. Walter Thorne waited 11 days for an answer in 1981 and got 4 minutes and then 30 years of fixing boilers. Elijah waited 2 weeks for an answer in this story and got a result that took 45 years to reach the person who could finally read it correctly. 45 years. That's not a story about one bad principle in one auditorium. That's a story about how long it can take for a true thing, said by the wrong person at the wrong time, to finally land in the right hands. Walter Thorne never got to see it land. He died not knowing whether he'd been right. He just wrote it down, carefully. The way you write something down when you've decided that even if nobody believes you now, the truth deserves a record, because records outlast rooms, and rooms change, eventually, even when the people in them don't. Here's my question for you, and I want you to actually sit with it before you answer. Is there something, an idea, an observation, a piece of work that you have written down, or started, or quietly built, that someone dismissed before they understood it? And did you keep the record anyway? Because somewhere, there's a Cordry University. There's a lab that will read the data and not care how old you are, or where you started, or who told you that you couldn't. The only thing that has to survive until then is the notebook. Tell me what's in yours.